my friends. Welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the conversation series where I sit down with other writers and have a fully fleshed, engaging conversation, kind of about whatever we want. But surprise, surprise, we mostly talk about writing. Before we get into it, just a reminder that my writing company called Unbound Writer is open for business. We are doing one-on-one coaching and mentoring with me. We are doing in-person retreats in Boulder, Colorado. And very soon, probably within the next month, we are going to be launching our first series of online courses where you can pay a small charge and have access to all the wisdom in the world of not only from myself, but from other writers that I'm going to be enlisting to record amazing courses as well. So you can find out everything you want to find out at unboundwriter.com. So be sure to please check that out. So today on the show, we have another guest that I've had on before. Again, as I've kind of said on this podcast, I don't typically have repeat guests, or not many. Usually I like to interview a guest and really go through their writing journey rather than focus on any particular book. So we usually establish that the first time that they're on. So usually when they're back on, it's kind of to talk shop, which I love to do. And it becomes very inside baseball in the sense that we just sit back and talk about, or bitch and moan about writing careers, or just really kind of inside stuff about the writing and the publishing industry. And I got a chance to do that today. So today on the show, I had my friend Aimie Runyan back on. So Aimie is awesome. And Aimie actually lives not too far from me here in Colorado. She lives up in Estes Park. And she writes a lot of different things, but she, as she says it on her website, she writes to celebrate history's unsung heroines. So she writes both kind of women's fiction / contemporary fiction. And we talk a lot about genre in this episode, and what is genre and what isn't genre, and can you even define it? And she writes a lot of historical fiction, usually focused on a heroine, a true to life heroine as well. So her latest book just came out, Memory of Lavender and Sage. So again, this is going to be classified under contemporary fiction / women's fiction, which she defines really nicely in this episode. But it was great talking to her because it's a chance for me to just sit back and just talk about the actual act of writing, and what has to come from your heart, not chasing trends. How do you find your voice? All these things that I don't necessarily go deeply into when I'm interviewing somebody for the first time. So we had a really engaging conversation. It even ended up going long because I wanted to keep talking. And of course, she had to make up a story with me all over again, which I think we did pretty well at this time. We were pretty proud of what we came up with. So you're going to like this one. This is my second conversation with Aimie Runyan.
Yeah, a neighbor of mine, Estes Park is a small town. She was having a birthday tea, and I really didn't want to miss out, because it's a little community. She's new here, trying to have a little bit of a social gathering. So, yeah, I had to basically okay, guys, it's been an hour and 45 minutes. I gotta go. Sorry.
I've got promotional stuff to do, and everyone's like, "Oh, how cool!"
Exactly. Exactly. Busy
Yeah, well, I
times.
thank you for rearranging the date. I'm leaving tomorrow to fly to Michigan and then drive back with my daughter in her car for
Fun times, fun
for the
times.
summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a whole different level of parenting I haven't gotten to yet. My kids are 11 and 13. So we're transitioning from being an elementary school household to middle school, entirely middle school now. It's a lot.
Every phase is different, and now I'm like, make sure that the oil's been changed. She's like, "What?" I'm like, "Dude, like."
Yep.
And she's listening to this right now because she edits this. But is your oil light on at all? She's like, "Yeah, but it's not to zero quite yet." And I'm like, "All right, well, I just get the oil change before we drive 1,500 miles."
Yeah. So we've been on road trips where we've had to get oil changes like 2 or 3 in the middle of the trip because
Oh
they're
boy.
so long. So I know how that goes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how's the writing been going?
Oh, so busy, so busy. I have just turned in a book last Monday, my next contemporary after The Memory of Lavender and Sage was my first contemporary. It was a 2-book contract. And then I turned in galley proofs on my next historical, which is coming out in September, Mademoiselle Eiffel, on Wednesday of the same week, which I'm pretty sure should be against the Geneva Convention to have 2 deadlines that close, but I did it. So,
Well, deadlines are tough anyway. I mean, I normally
yeah.
don't work with a deadline except for my own self-imposed deadline. I usually sell, with one exception, I usually sell 1 book at a time. So it's like
Yeah.
whatever I want to do. And it usually takes me like 8 to 10 months to write that draft and give it a couple edits. And, but it always takes a little bit longer with agent feedback and stuff. But deadlines are like rough. I mean, they're good sometimes because they give you structure, I guess.
Yeah.
But when there's
And
2 in that narrow time frame.
yeah, it's rough. And, I joke that the executive function part of my brain is staffed exclusively by overcaffeinated squirrels. And so any structure I can give my life is a good thing. Because, I am kind of in a sense, the quintessential right-brained creative type, even though I do love data and, sales figures and all that stuff. It's hard, but I do like having that structure in place. And I'm finding out that and I'm not even talking, I've done a couple of joint author projects, like a third of a novel with 2 other authors. And that's fun. That's all fine. But, doing more than a book about every 8 months is so hard. And,
Yeah.
I think a book, it's finding the balance between publishing often enough to stay relevant, publishing often enough to make a living, and publishing often enough to maintain your readership, because you go 2-3 years between a book, people forget who you are.
Yeah.
But then balancing that without not choking out your readers who have a lot of other favorite authors. I might be somebody's, in somebody's top tier shelf, but if they've got 7 other authors they love producing a book in the next 3 months, that's a lot of books for them to invest their time and money in.
Yeah. And there's only so much you can control of all of that. And I think it's identifying what you can. So for example, your comment, which is a very fair one about publishing enough to make a living at it, or at least to have some kind of income flow from it, that all presumes that someone's going to want to buy your book, a
Yep.
publisher, which no matter how established you are, you never know. You never know. They
Never.
might be like,
There are no
we're not,
guarantees in this business.
we're not
Yeah.
doing this anymore. And even if they do, it's like, okay, my advance was X. Now it's like X divided by 2 because of, for whatever reason. And you have no idea, the marketing or the sales push might change. You might be changing publishers. So it's really, but you're right. It's almost just like keep putting out content as long as it's like still true to your soul
Oh, for
and you're not
sure.
feeling like you're just writing shit just to get stuff out there.
Oh, God,
Um,
no. God, no. And, I've been so fortunate in that, between the fact that, my muse never takes a nap, and I've had a lot of ideas that I'm genuinely excited about. And being married to a historian, which I highly recommend for any aspiring historical authors, being married to a historian, like A Bakery in Paris, which is the book of my heart, was something that he inspired when we were first dating.
hmm.
And, so having that, and being in a bookish household, I'm sitting in our library right now, and this is my bookshelf. That's his bookshelf and all of his files and everything. And so we're constantly talking books, and the muse is constantly working, and I have an idea file that runneth over. And I
Right.
love that. But then finding it's sort of like trying to find the time to get all these ideas downloaded out of my brain, but not publishing them so fast that I tire my readers, you know?
Right. Or
Yeah.
yourself. I mean,
Yeah, or myself. And it's been, razor thin between me and burnout.
well,
Yeah.
and you're not necessarily different in this sense. A lot of people do this. I don't, but you write different types of things.
Hmm.
So the idea of writing historical fiction, for example, is a whole different proposition than writing, like, say, genre fiction, because when you think about, okay, 8 months, I'm going to write this book. When you layer on all the research you need to do and the historical accuracies, to me, that sounds like a lot longer of a project than
It
writing one of the
is.
silly little stories I write. So
Yeah. So
yeah,
the
and it's got to be in
projects.
your heart.
Oh, absolutely. The projects end up interleaving a lot, and that's great, actually,
Huh.
because my latest, the book I just finished, And my book I just last published, and there's going to be a historical in the middle of the two publishing wise,
Of
are
course there is.
contemporary fiction, which does require significant amount less research, not zero, but
So
it does, yeah, it's like Google searches and stuff instead of going to the archives in
So
Paris.
define that a little bit, because so in talking about The Memory of Lavender and Sage, which just came out, I believe, last month,
Mm-hmm.
which has got a beautiful cover. It's almost Monet-esque a
Yes,
little
I
bit.
love it.
um, your website calls it women's fiction. You're referring to it as contemporary fiction. Define that for the listeners.
It really is just, I mean, it's contemporary fiction. I'm moving away from women's fiction is a genre, that in and of itself, it means it's a book in which a female heroine goes on an emotional journey and saves herself. And I love that definition. I love that genre of fiction. Often there's a romantic, storyline. There doesn't have to be. There certainly is in mine because I love the romance. But it's not the formula, and to say romance is such a hard genre to do. So I'm not in any way speaking down about romance, but there's a certain set of expectations. Boy meets girl, circumstances keep them apart, and then they find their way back together. That can be subverted in women's fiction if there is a romance, which there doesn't have to be.
Right.
Now, so basically it's a story about an emotional journey that takes place in the present time. It leans a little bit more literary. And it is, it is deeply atmospheric. My brand, I call it virtual vacation fiction, because there's an
I like that.
emotional complexity to it, but it's also a bit escapist. And people have described it as a warm hug set in Provence. And I love that because isn't that what we all need? I mean, I wrote The School for German Brides, which was the darkest, grittiest historical fiction you can imagine. It's World War II from the Lion's Den. And then compare that to this woman buying a ramshackle farmhouse in Provence, sight unseen, and
Right.
dealing with family issues and the feeling of never being connected to her family for various reasons. It's a world apart. And it does feel like a palate cleanser in between the historical works that are often dealing with dark, heavy issues. And these are different issues that don't tend to be quite as dark, but are also, very significant, but on a more personal level rather than a general societal level, like a war novel.
Yeah, and typically I would say, it's funny just thinking about defining genres or lack of genres. And, when you think
Mm-hmm.
about literary fiction, for example, being perhaps more character than plot driven, maybe
Mm-hmm.
is kind of a broader term, but it's funny because I'm creating online courses for part of my Unbound Writer company. And so I'm recording one right now just about how I
Right.
write thrillers. And I literally, right before talking to you, I recorded a whole segment on just talking about the thriller genre and just about genres in general. And it's crazy when you start to look at them from an author's perspective, because if you look at thrillers, there's a million different types of thrillers, but then under each one there's subgenres.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes authors spend too much time worrying about what they're writing rather than writing what they want to write and just letting somebody else figure out what it is, because that's their job,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. And that's so hard because when you go to an agent with a book idea, they need to know how to pitch it. They need to know where the editor is going to know, to tell where is Barnes and Noble going to put it on the shelf.
Right.
And it feels like that's a question that has to be answered before, sometimes even before the book is written. But if you look at it, the best books, the biggest books, subvert genre completely.
Absolutely. I just interviewed on a live panel Ramona Emerson, and she was describing her book, and I hate the fact that I can't remember the name of it right now. But definitely that, it was, I think it was her debut, and it just so not only subverted genres, I think it just couldn't be defined. And I was asking her,
Yeah.
I'm like, was that a trouble selling it? And she's like, it was, but like my agent just loved it so much that she didn't give up, and it was shortlisted for the National Book Award.
That's
So
amazing. And
it's
yeah,
amazing.
doesn't
And
that happen? Yeah. It
yeah, I
happens a
mean,
lot.
you
Yeah.
have to, I mean, I think you distill it down to an essence, and the essence is the writing has to be good. It
Oh
has to
yeah.
be a well-written story above whether it's plot or emotional driven or character driven. the writing has to be compelling, no matter what. And this is the shit that drives me crazy, is like when I talk to thriller writers, they're like, well, I have an idea for something, but it's kind of a literary thriller. And to me, that's just kind of saying, I don't believe in genres because genres feel cheap to me. And I want to say this is a better written book. So it's a literary thriller. And to me, I'm like, well, it should already be a good written, but it should already be
Yeah.
well written. That doesn't matter.
Yeah, and so I'm teaching a class, historical fiction for Story Summit. We had this discussion last week. We'll have it again tomorrow. Is that they defined that literary fiction is more character driven, genre fiction is more plot driven, and that's not true anymore.
It's not true at all.
If you're getting published with a house of any size, it's character driven. It
Yeah.
has to
Yeah.
be. And the thing is, even in literary fiction now, stuff just has to happen. You can't just get away with a character sketch.
Right.
But it's really that Venn diagram is becoming closer to a circle. And isn't that just a great time to be a reader? Because I think character stuff gets us invested. You can have the most compelling plot in the world, but if you have this kind of tabula rasa character,
Yeah.
where the
Who gives
reader
a
is free
shit?
to insert themselves,
Yeah.
it rings hollow compared to somebody with creating a hero with flaws and wants and desires of
Right.
their own. And
I
that's,
think
for me, that's 3/4 of the fun of writing is creating these characters.
100%, because I think the base level of good writing is creating empathy. And I think you can't, I think that it's very difficult to do that unless you yourself as the author have deep wells of empathy, especially depending on what POV you're writing from. If you're writing first person present tense, like I tend to do because I love it, you have to be an empathetic person, I
Oh,
think.
absolutely. I'm a big first person person.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
it's because like you said, because you're sitting down writing and you're thinking as you're writing, Jesus, what would I do in this situation? What would I do if I were my own character? And that's what you want your readers to do. But you can only do that convincingly if you truly have that inherent empathy and curiosity within you. And so I think not only does it have to be character driven, I think it has to be emotion driven. I think
oh,
constant,
absolutely.
constantly you should be saying, how is my character feeling right now? And am I
Yeah.
showing that in a way that's not over the top, but like, how does it make me feel? And how do I convey that to the reader?
Oh, it's so funny when I've graded. So I'm a mentor. I'm a MFA mentor for Drexel University. So
Mm.
yeah, I've got a lot of side gigs going on, but I'm constantly in the notes of my students' work. How does the character feel right now? I feel like I'm a therapist, like sitting on the couch. How do you feel? How do you feel
Right.
right now? Let's go through this word and also have a visceral reaction. We need to see what the character is feeling and having a physical reaction to the news that was just imparted, because that's how we do. And it's one of those things where it starts off as at the most basic level. Conversation doesn't happen in a vacuum. We have to have a back and forth. There needs to be blocking. I'm an ex-theater kid, so we're talking about blocking like on a stage. You have to visualize that, but then deeper, have them react and
Right.
have them react in the moment. And so it's something I'm constantly asking my students: how does this make your character feel?
But isn't
And
it
get it
interesting
on.
also though, like when you say that, because I think that's perfect, tremendous advice, but you still have to be capable as the writer of doing something of committing to that organically. So if you say the character just received, hey, your car estimate for the damage is going to be $2,000, not $1,000, and you have the character literally fall off of a chair in shock, that's that's
It's over the
garbage.
top. Yeah,
Right?
it's over the
So it's
top.
like,
Yeah.
but I think people sometimes, if they're not great writers, they have in their mind, like, here are reactions to fear, here are reactions to surprise, physical reactions, because I've heard show don't tell. And
Mhm.
that's all bullshit, because I think you can actually tell. You can have internal monologue, you can
Well,
have
yeah.
things happening, and it should be real. If somebody's like truly scared, there could be nausea involved because that's what
Exactly, the
happens.
bile
If
rising from the stomach, and you have to be careful to don't overuse that, but
Right, right.
yeah.
There's
But
nothing like a good vomit in a story and really
oh
just
God,
going,
yeah. And the truth of the matter is, and that's where it's tempting for the author, especially in first person, to insert themselves in the character. But like a character who has let's take it even down a notch, who has something break on their car. that's going to cost, $100, and they're down to their last $5.
Right.
That's desperate. That's
Right.
desperate. And that's not a situation I'm in. So I have to take, I've never been, thank God, I've never been in that situation financially. I mean, I've been poor, but I haven't been that poor.
Right.
And, if you're writing somebody that is that hard on their luck, taking getting outside yourself to empathize with that is, that's the main exercise of what we're doing as authors.
Right, and it's not, depending on who you are, it's not that hard to do. You think about Jean Valjean stealing a loaf of bread in Les Mis, and that's what causes him his whole great quest and downfall. And yeah, you and I can't relate to that, but in our own lives. But when you watch it, it's so well written that you're like, of course, I totally get how desperate that
Yeah,
must feel to do that. Even though it goes against his conscience. But and it also just takes a lot of words. It takes a lot of like screwing
yeah,
up, not
yeah, to
doing it
feel it.
well. And yeah, and then because I was having this conversation the other day, like I don't like, when we talk about finding your voice and
Mhm.
talk about something that's even less defined than genre is one's voice. And how
Yeah.
do you define it? And some people have very distinct voices. You think of somebody like Cormac McCarthy, for example. You read a page of anything, you're like, oh, that's clearly Cormac McCarthy. But I'm like, I don't think I found my voice until my third book. And
Oh,
I
for
think I
sure.
I think I only found I think I found and I don't think I solidified my voice until my fifth book, because that's when I started writing first person present tense. And it felt the most organic to me. And it became a really compelling story. And I'm like, that's my voice, because I should have been writing from this perspective all along. But when you first start out, you read books, you're like, people write third person past tense. That's how books are written. And that's how you start out, and you realize like, oh, it doesn't have to be like this.
Yeah.
Um,
I feel like I jumped leaps and bounds when I left third person behind after my second book.
yeah.
And yeah, I mean, because I went from writing, I mean, my first two books were set in the 1660s in colonial Canada. And they didn't do well because, I mean, shocker of all shocks, Canadian colonials didn't become the next big thing. Though they did really nicely as backlist books when they did price
Then you
drops.
look
So
at
I will say,
Shogun.
yeah, exactly. So they've actually done really well. I'm not going to complain. But I moved when I wrote Daughters of the Night Sky, which you see back there, which is, it's World War II Russian female fighter pilots. And I moved to first person, and it's whereas it's a lot more action packed, and there's a lot of character stuff going on, but it is really, really action packed compared to like the slow journey over from France to Canada, and kind of the man versus nature. Well, this is man versus machine gun. It's a little bit more fast paced.
Right.
And and that's where I feel like I started to come into my stride as well. And being able to get closer to the story, closer to the characters. And she was a tough nut to crack. And she's a Russian officer in the Air Force. She is all business and did not have time to talk to me. Whereas in my next book, Ruby from Philadelphia was far more chatty. She was a telephone operator. She liked talking to me,
That's
and
funny.
finally
Yeah.
getting able to get into her head, and it was a lot easier.
Yeah, it's so weird. Like I'm co-writing something right now, and it's YA, so they're all 16 and 17 years old, but there's a
Mm-hmm.
group of like 6 kids. But I'm like, I'm only writing this first person present tense because that's what I want to do. So it's from one
Yeah.
kid's point of view. And then you start thinking like I need to have them. So you can't really, it's hard to develop other characters because your character always has to be there
Mm-hmm.
for that to happen. So all of a sudden you're like, boy, we haven't seen this other person in quite some time. So we need another scene with her. So it's you got to kind of balance it. But I think once you find that way, like you said, moving away from third person, all of a sudden it feels like things are clicking. The writing's always easier because you're building that muscle constantly, but it's more
Mm-hmm.
than that. It's like I see this story more than I've ever had before, and I don't outline, so I
Yeah.
never see anything. But there's more of a feeling behind it, and I think that's totally tied to finding your voice at the same time.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And it's finding the character. For me, it often happens organically, but sometimes it's harder than others. But because you don't always vibe with your own characters. But for me, I just know that you take the story, the thing, and the character, the someone, and the story is something happening to someone. Plot plus character equals story. And that the character needs to have certain qualities for the story to be interesting.
Right.
because the story happening to, person Y instead of person X is going to be very different. It's going to
Right.
be very different. And so, you might not always click with the character that needs to be the one telling the story, but it's awfully nice when it does work out that way.
Yeah. And you realize your characters are like real people in the sense that you go to a cocktail party and you have small talk, like, God, everybody here is boring. But then you pull somebody aside and you just start to ask them kind of crazy questions and they start to tell you crazy answers. And you realize like everybody is kind of inherently interesting. It's a matter of digging into them enough to find that and get them to share what's interesting. And your characters are the same way. You can take somebody on the surface who's an everyday person who you're like, how is that a hero or heroine? And you get inside their head a little bit and you're like, oh, they're just as fucked up as I am. That's
Yep.
interesting. And that's what I love is I love the unpeeling of the layers to find out like what are they really thinking and what makes them compelling and what makes them relatable, even if they're totally different than other people. And
Yeah. Some
it's
people
never
just have a
easy to do, but
thicker,
it's
yeah. Yeah. Some people just have a thicker social veneer than others and takes a little bit more sand to get down to the real
yeah.
stuff.
I remember with the book that just came out, I don't know if we talked about this on last time we spoke, but The Father She Went to Find, the protagonist is a 21-year-old female savant in 1987. And I second guessed myself and I wrote the entire thing third person past because I'm like, I don't think I can get inside her head enough. And then my editor's like, I am not relating to this book at all. And we went through a lot of different edits. And then finally, I'm like, let me write 20 pages, first person present. And she read it. She's like, "Oh, there she is. There's the character." And so I'm like, "Oh,
Yep.
fuck." So rewrote the entire, which was actually, even though it took me 4 months to do it, it was a great exercise to go through because it really opened my eyes to like, you're not just changing the words because the voice completely changes. You might as well start with a blank page, for all the work that it takes to do that. But it
Oh, for
really opened my
sure.
eyes of like, oh, this is because I didn't have my voice there. I was so scared about not getting close enough to her that I made the character actually less relatable.
It's so
So,
hard. It's so hard.
yeah, but it was a great
Y-
lesson for me.
Yeah, for me, it's like I have to start the story. Like Mademoiselle Eiffel, my book that's coming out in September. I started and restarted that book like three different times before I figured out where the story began. And
Mhm.
it seems like such a basic thing, but it's so important, especially when you're selling a book, to know exactly, the moment where it should begin. And I'm going through that again, because I'm writing a book. I can't talk a lot about it yet because it's not under contract, but it's kind of a book about books. And my agent's like, you've got to hit that from the ground running. There's other big social issues going on, but the hook is it's a book about books, and which is a big thing right now. And so you got to hit the ground running. And sometimes it's figuring out where the book starts to really figure out what is driving the character forward.
Yeah.
And those two things for me feel kind of interconnected because especially since I started working with my current agent, she's had me restart books several times and
That's
redo the
interesting.
sample chapters multiple times, and it sets the rest of the project off on the right foot once we
Yeah,
get that down.
totally. And when I do coaching, sometimes I'm reading, and if I'm doing thriller coaching, I'm reading a manuscript and I'm like, chapter 4, that's where it should start. You don't need
Hmm.
chapters 1 through. I don't need to know all this information. Maybe eventually I do. Chapter 4 grabbed me right away. Like start there
Yep,
because I can tell you any prospective agent looking at this, if they're not hooked in 3 pages with it,
they're
and
done.
I'm using a thriller as an example. This is not apply to everything. Yeah, they're looking for reasons to reject you because
Because
they
they don't
have
have time
so
to
much.
take everybody on. Yeah.
They have this massive slush pile and they're not even looking at it usually. They have people going through the slush pile. So you've got to just, even if it's a little heavy-handed, it's got to be right out of the gate. Why do I care? And it's it's hard to sometimes have that perspective as a writer, even a seasoned author, to have that perspective. And so that feedback as you're writing, like you said, you've restarted that book several times for your agent. You need that person to say, it's not quite there yet.
Yep.
And and a lot of people work in a vacuum, and it's just the wrong decision.
Yeah, it's hard. And for me, it's I often have to add more beforehand. Like I'm so wrapped up in starting in media res in the middle of the action. And they're like, no, that's not quite like the really exciting part. And so you think about what is, the pivotal moment. You think about, this classical story structure. Where does, starting at the moment where the real world is, showing the hero in the real world or their unaltered state, but on the precipice of change, and figuring
Right.
out where the most, because it's kind of it can be a subtle thing. It could be any number of events leading up to that. You have to figure out what's the most exciting one,
Right.
you know?
Right. What's the context of for this character prior to the inciting event, whatever that is, and that inciting event has to come pretty quickly. Again, depending on what you're writing, but I think some people will have that lead up, the character establishment be way too dense, and so there might be massive pages of descriptions or massive pages of backstory, and like you said, it can be subtle. It can be how that person looks at another person for half a second can tell you volumes
Yeah.
about who they are. I That's the part that's so much fun in editing, to just getting rid of all that stuff and being like, no, he just
Yeah.
needs to look over this way.
And the thing is, like, don't feel bad. Anybody who's listening to this and who realizes they need to throw out their first three chapters, you needed to write those for
Right.
you. But the
Right.
rest of us don't necessarily need to read them. I remember for my first book, because it's three different women, it's a multiple POV book, and they're all traipsing off from France to Canada. And the first chapter for each showed them at the moment where they decided to go. But it felt like the story was starting over again three times. So I had a woman standing on the edge of a barren field. I had a woman in fighting with her mother in a kitchen, and another one who was in an orphanage, a women's prison, basically,
Yeah.
who was, miserable. And I'm
Right.
like, which of those three things, if I had to chop two, where am I going to start the story? And of course, the women's hospital, because it's a banner location that it had to be in Paris. The other two didn't have to be in France necessarily. So, but then it was all about forward motion. So then I cut those first two chapters and I wove them into each of them. And so the first one was in Paris. The next chapter is the boat ride over. The third chapter is them arriving in Canada. And so it's literally moving the story forward, but weaving in their backstory a little bit more deftly instead of, throwing an entire clove of garlic in the stew, mincing it more finely and working it throughout. Sorry, I use lots of food metaphors. It's kind of my thing. But
That's okay.
yeah. And it's all about weaving it in such a way that it's like, oh, that little sentence, you give your secret slowly. All good stories reveal their secrets slowly, and they reveal themselves in due course. Even if they're fast paced, they don't give up all their secrets at once.
Right.
And that's something that's a trick to learn. And that's why when you hear authors like Lisa Wingate at one of the last conferences, a historical novel society, said that she didn't break out into her 31st book, and it's because she was still learning her craft. I mean, part of it's industry stuff. I'm
Yeah.
sure her previous books are all brilliant too, but there was something about that book that also hit the zeitgeist. But she was honing her craft throughout those previous 31 books, which did well, but they weren't breakout like I can't remember the name of her book, When We Were Yours. That was a big
Yeah.
breakout book. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny, I look at my own career and you can define breakout however you want.
Hmm.
But I would say I haven't had a breakout yet, but I can look at my career of, my 10th book will be coming out in January. And just like I see this steady increase in readership.
Yep.
All of a sudden I haven't had like a million copy sale, something crazy like, but nobody, very few people do. But I can
Hmm.
see like it's growing and growing and growing, and then people are getting to know me more. But then you also see other people who like their second or third book, or sometimes their first book is this like mega, Reese Witherspoon. It's on her book list, so all of a sudden you have that thing that again you can't control, but that becomes a breakout book, and you might not follow up with another one that sells
Yeah, and that's
nearly as well as
heartbreaking
that.
too. So,
Yeah, but
it's
that's
a
actually more
marathon.
common.
Yeah,
Yeah,
this whole process is a marathon, and I think that the people who really slowly build a readership and then maybe have a Reese Witherspoon moment are going to be really better off because they will have built a readership organically.
right.
And I think you look at Kate Quinn, where she had six gorgeous books before she had the Alice Network. That was Reese Witherspoon's first pick, and it went stratospheric. And then she had a second Reese Witherspoon pick with the following book, The Huntress. And then after that, everything, she hasn't had that since for her 2 books following, but she's retained her readership because
Right.
she built a fan base, and I
Right.
think that's the key thing. And it's hard to build a fan base, but I think that being yourself online, being online, being authentically you, and writing the books that really resonate with you and resonate with your heart is all going to come out, and you're going to find your people eventually. It's not easy, but you will.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to make too, to, aspiring writers out there. Unfortunately, it's not just about writing books at this point in the zeitgeist, because you get the fan base through your books, but you have to maintain that fan base, to your point. And that means you're hopefully sending out a newsletter, or you're engaging with fans on social media, or you're going to conferences where people can meet you, or you're doing book signings,
All of
because
the above. Yeah.
they will forget you. Like you said, the book, it doesn't come out for 2 years. This book that just came out, because of all those rewrites, I had a 2-year gap, and it felt
Hmm.
good to get something back out there again,
Oh
because I'm
yeah.
like, because it's scared. So, yeah, but you've got to do all this stuff, or you have to at least hire people to help you with this stuff, and you have a website presence and all there's a minimum that you need to do, to maintain that fan base. But nothing happens without a good story, a well-written
Yeah,
story.
and I think the thing that, and most of us learn this through the School of Hard Knocks, but there are a lot of people that, and there are people who've had amazing luck, but I'd say more often than not, like people that spend $1 zillion on a publicist, they might get a couple nice PR hits, but it really doesn't pan out necessarily into sales. They feel like they need to do that. Excuse me. They feel like they need to do that in order to show their publisher that they're working and to help their book break out. But I think the reality is that building a fan base through consistent, building of the newsletter is yours. You own it. Nobody
Right.
can take that list away from you. Whereas, we've seen what's happened with Twitter. It's kind of evaporating. It's
Right.
hanging on by its teeth, by the skin of its teeth. But it's a platform that is whose influence is waning, and that could happen with all of Meta, who knows.
Right.
But you own your newsletter, but having a presence on these things and doing it well and doing it consistently in the platforms that you enjoy is going to yield a lot more results. The slow and steady wins the race.
Yeah.
There's no expensive cure-all to getting your book to become a bestseller.
No.
Aside from hoping that your publisher really pushes it, but even then, if you talk to a publisher, over drinks in a bar, they'll tell you there have been books that they put tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars in publicity into, and that flopped. And
Yep.
so there is something ineffable about the success of books that even the people in the industry can't predict.
Yeah.
And then
Totally.
books that come out of nowhere and all of a sudden hit the Times, it's rare, but it happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. I mean, and it depends on what else is coming out that week, and
Hmm.
yeah, there's just so much that you can't control. But we do it because we love it, and
Yeah,
that's one of
absolutely.
the main thing. When I'm doing a coaching program with somebody, or a retreat, the very first thing I say as a writer you need to do is ask yourself, why am I writing? Like, why? Like, really, really analyze why you're doing it, because you have to be able to answer that, I think. Because if your answer is like, I want to make a career out of this, that might not be the best why, for being,
Hmm.
because it's such a tough job. But
It is.
it's so fulfilling, that I think if you're not writing for the sheer love of storytelling, because there's so many days that are miserable and you don't love it and it feels like data entry, that if you don't have that underlying, love for it, if you're saying I'm doing this to support my family, you're in it for the wrong.
Yeah, if you're in it to become famous or you're in it to become rich, the chances of it happening aren't zero, but they're pretty remote. If you ask, a family of non-readerly types that don't have bookshelves like this behind them, or yours, they're going to be like, well, I know Stephen King, James Patterson, and J.K. Rowling. And they're not going to know anybody else beyond that. Becoming a famous author is almost impossible outside of the literary circles. And
Becoming a
becoming
published author, much less famous. Getting an
Yeah,
agent.
exactly. Yeah, getting the foot in the door is hard enough. But then, making a sustainable living. I mean, I don't know of hardly any authors, unless they come from money or they married an extremely wealthy spouse that aren't cobbling together a living. I don't have to teach, but I do because I like the security. I like having, other things other than writing active on my CV. Because the reality is I am always, and it sucks, but there's always a pot in the back of my head that says the next contract might not come.
Yeah.
Because the reality is right now I've fulfilled my two contracts with Harper Muse and William Morrow. They might not sign me for a next book. They love me. They love working with me. They know that I work my rear end off.
Right.
But they are not even my editor at William Morrow, who I love to death, who's the VP of whatever fancy thing. She is not the buck does not stop with her. It stops with sales.
Right.
And ultimately, everything for the better for worse, I won't say for better or for worse, it's for worse, has become financialized. Like the CFO, the buck always stops with the CFO.
Right.
At this point in time. And it's becoming more and more so. And it's unfortunate, but the reality is they do have to try to make a profit.
Yeah, of
And
course.
otherwise nobody's books are going to get published. And that's
Right.
why, as much as we want to turn up our nose at the big celebrity books, like, well, I can pick on Prince Harry, not that I don't have sympathy for him, but Prince Harry's books came out, sucked all the air out of the room. But then, his book allowed them to take a chance on how many more debuts
Right.
because of the profit they
It's like
turned.
the movie industry. Yeah, same
Yeah,
thing. Yeah,
yeah,
totally.
absolutely.
Yeah, or your editor could go to a different house, or all these things you can control.
Oh
You
yeah.
just, but if you step back and just like stay committed, you're writing every day, you're writing what you love, and it's coming from your heart and the story that you want to tell, and you're writing it well, then
Mhm.
that's what you can control.
Yeah, the
And
books
if you
are the
do
one
those
thing you
things,
can't control. Yeah.
good things will happen. I am convinced of that. But
Hmm.
if you miss any of those things, you're screwed.
Yeah, it's true. And if you're writing to what you think is going to be the next big bestseller because you think it's going to be the next big bestseller, chances are you're going to be making yourself miserable unless it just so happens the stars align and you happen to be writing the genre that's going to be hot. Like right now, what is it? Super direct address murder mysteries. Like everybody in my family's killed someone, which is a brilliant. I love the audiobook. Absolutely loved it. I love direct address. But that's not me. Like I would struggle writing that well. And even if I thought came up with a clever idea to write one of those, I'd probably pass the idea on to somebody else that I thought would do better because
Right.
I don't think I could pull it off.
Or by
You
the
know,
time you write it and you go to sell it, the market's
it's been
passed.
done.
All
Yeah.
right. Like writing
Yeah,
to the market
vampires have
is one
had
of the
their
worst
moment.
decisions.
Witches have had their moment. Yeah. And that's the thing, like, in historical fiction, we have to worry about, like World War II had been a big thing for years, for a long time in the early 2000s. It was the Tudors because of Philippa Gregory and the HBO series, The Tudors. It was the
Mhm.
Tudors. And then all of a sudden it's World War II. Since like, I don't know, it really took off in about 2015 that
Mhm.
the World War II, I mean, it was always a thing, but it became the thing. And now it is and isn't waning. Nobody knows what the next big thing is.
Right.
But if you jump in, thinking, oh, this is going to be, the 1960s are going to be the next big thing. It may have already passed, or it may not. In the because historical fiction, I guess the advantage is that some of those trends last longer. But finding a fresh take that somebody wants to read is going to be hard when everybody's trying to do the same thing.
Well, I heard the next
And
big thing is going to be 1600s Canada, is what I
yeah,
heard.
let's do it. Go back to my roots. Yeah, the Fille du Bois. Let's go back. Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Well, Amy, we're going to wrap up. Before we do, we have to, what show you're on. So
Yep, making things up. Let's make some stuff up.
we're going to do the storytelling part of the show. So I've chosen 3 books at random off my bookshelves. You're going to choose one of these books. We're going to choose a random sentence from a random page. I'm going to read that sentence, and that'll be the first sentence, and just maybe a 2 or 3 minute long short story. So I've got these are very random. Dean Koontz's Odd Thomas,
Nice,
uh, Donna Tartt's Little Friend,
nice.
and Herman Koch's The Dinner. So choose one of those.
Oh, let's go with Donna Tartt for fun.
Very nice. I love this book. Boy, I didn't really remember that it was this long. Choose a page between 1 and 600.
Okay, let's go with 374.
Find it. I don't remember how the story went last time. Was it a train wreck? Do you remember?
Oh, it was a train wreck because I'm bad at doing this off the cuff, but I'll do my best.
Okay. Yeah, they're always train wrecks, so it's usually okay. I'm going to find a very basic sentence here that we can do. So it's a piece of dialogue. It's just one
Okay, great.
sentence. There's nothing you can do for her.
You have to let it go. She's gonna. You just have to do what's best for you now.
I looked at the doctor, aware that I maybe blinked once in the last minute, absorbing what he was telling me, that she was going to die. He looked at me as if I were in shock, but what he didn't realize is this is what I'd been waiting for years.
The relief lapped over me, and I allowed him to think it was the numbness of a loving partner in shock. But all I could sense was the bonds that tied me to this person were one by one snapping in a way that would finally set me free.
There was only one little problem. I had to get that voice memo off of her phone. And she never told me what her security code was. And I'm not sure if she even uses face recognition. All I know is that phone sat right on that hospital table next to her bed, taunting me.
I wasn't sure if I could trust anybody to help hack into the phone. The information might be more valuable than any fee I might be able to pay. But I racked my brain thinking of who I could trust well enough to try and break into the security, or if the staff would allow me to stay with her long enough to see if I could use the face recognition, or if I would have to risk my own freedom to delete that memo.
I turned to the doctor, asked him what I thought would be a gentle question, one that he would certainly understand. Is there any chance she might come out of it for even a minute so I can say goodbye and she can say goodbye to me?
The doctor looked at me with sympathy. He put his hand on mine. I was pleased to know that he was reading this exactly how I wanted him to, as a grieving partner who only wanted one more moment with their spouse, one more moment for closure on a lifetime of happy memories. But those happy memories, they were just an illusion that we'd shown to the world for the last 15 years.
He softly shook his head and said, "I'm sorry." Fuck. All right, we'll call it there.
Hey, that wasn't that bad.
That was good. I would read
better
that.
than last time.
I want to know what that voice memo is what she has on her phone.
Oh, I like that.
And there's got to be a reason he can't just throw the phone away.
Yeah. Records, you got to think about who behind the scenes would be able to hack into her phone that would have, the motive, they know that the spouse had motive. I love this.
See,
that was fun.
See, now that can go into your idea file, and 8 years from now, when you're going through it, you can finally get to it.
Yeah, there you go. Awesome.
Well, listen, Aimie, congrats on the recent release, The Memory of Lavender and Sage. It looks gorgeous. I'm sure it's a wonderful book. And yeah, you're busy. You've got a lot of stuff coming out. So
yeah, absolutely.
Hope to see you soon.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Carter.
So that's it, folks. That is my second conversation with Aimie Runyan. Her new book is out right now, The Memory of Lavender and Sage, and it looks amazing. So I highly encourage you to go pick that up and check her out. If you haven't already read the book, you can find her at aimiekrunyan.com, and that's Aimie, A-I-M-I-E, not the typical A-M-Y. So please go find out everything you want to find out about Aimie. And while you're online, go ahead and check out my website, carterwilson.com. You can find out my event dates. You can buy my books. You can subscribe to my newsletter or read my blog or all of the above. And also, please, if you're an aspiring writer or struggling writer or an established writer looking kind of for a new boost, check out my website, unboundwriter.com, where you can read about the services we offer in terms of one-on-one coaching and mentoring, in-person retreats in Boulder, Colorado, and online writing classes. Friends, that's it for now. That's this episode of Making It Up. We'll have another episode out for you next week. In the meantime, take care.